So we're moving back in time, and I think that that's a wonderful way to get a perspective on these ancient discourses of liberty. I'm grateful to the two previous speakers for setting things up for me so well. I'm going to talk about liberty and democracy in ancient Athens in the 5th and 4th century BCE. And the question that I want to ask is this. In ancient Athens in the 4th century BCE, what did it mean to be free? I'm going to suggest an answer to that question, and I'm going to use that as a way into talking about the ancient Greek discourse of liberty, comparing it to the modern discourse of liberty, and then finish with a couple of suggestions about practical things that we might take from this comparison to enhance our own struggle to preserve liberty and democracy today. So, in ancient Athens, in the 5th and 4th centuries BCE, what did it mean to be free? I suggest that it meant at least four things, and I'm going to focus my discussion on these four things. Let me just list them. First of all, it meant not being a slave, not being like Spartacus. Secondly, it meant not living under a tyranny. Third, it meant that you were able to participate in political life and political discourse to a very high degree. And fourth, it meant that you could live essentially as you liked without constraint from external individuals. Let me now talk a little bit more about each one of those 4 points, expanding on them to enrich the picture. So my first point, I need say very little more about slavery. Of course, ancient Athens was a slave society, as was ancient Rome. So if you were free in ancient Athens, you were very well aware that you were not a slave. How many slaves were there in ancient Athens? Well, it's difficult to say precisely, but perhaps there were 80 to 100,000 slaves in ancient Athens out of a total population of 300,000 people living in ancient Attica, that is the region around Athens. So it's an extraordinarily high number of slaves. Slaves were deeply intertwined into ancient Athenian society. So whatever we say about the promise of liberty, of course, it didn't extend to slaves. So if you were free in ancient Athens, you were very conscious that you were not a slave. You were also very conscious that you were not living under a tyranny. The Athenians had deep experience with autocratic rule from the time of the 6th century BCE, when they were ruled by the Pisistrated tyrant, the tyrant Pisistratus and his sons, the overthrowing of whom was, of course, the foundational act of the Athenian democracy, which began in traditionally 508 BCE. So the reality, the danger of tyrannical power was always present for ancient Athens, and it was deeply embedded in the DNA of an ancient Athenian. The ancient Athenian knew he was not ruled by a tyrant. He was indeed a democratic citizen. Now, the ancient Greek political thinkers, based on this experience of tyranny and other forms of government, devised a theory whereby there were three essential forms of government. There was tyranny, ruled by one person. There was oligarchy, ruled by a few people. Of course, that would be the rich. And then there was democracy, which was ruled by everybody. Of course, in practice, that meant that the poor generally had a deciding voice in political discussion because there were more of them than the rich. But in principle, Athenian democracy said, this is government of everybody. Everybody participates in a more or less equal way in the government. Now, it's extraordinary that the ancient sources tell us, and Aristotle in particular tells us, among other sources, that it was only in democracy that liberty was achieved. In fact, the Democrats purported to be able to achieve liberty for citizens, and they said that, in fact, only in democracy could one live freely. Let me read a passage here of Aristotle's Politics, where Aristotle is commenting on this fact. Now, Aristotle is not, of course, himself a Democrat. He doesn't believe in democracy as such, but he does report the views of democratic thinkers. And this is what he is doing in this passage. A basic principle of the democratic constitution is liberty. People constantly make this statement, implying that only in this constitution do men share in liberty. For every democracy, they say, has liberty for its aim. So according to this view, which Aristotle says was quite common in his day, only under democracy is liberty possible. So it's clear that for the ancient Athenians anyway, oligarchy, being deprived of political power because rule is in the hands of the few, that did not allow for true liberty. Liberty required being able to participate in running the state in the way that the ancient Athenians could do. So that brings me to my third point, which is the point about political participation. Now, I have to say very clearly that political participation in this society was limited to adult male citizens. So females were excluded, slaves were, of course, excluded, and the many resident foreigners in Athens were also excluded from political participation. But the opportunities for political participation for the adult male citizens were quite extraordinary. So you could go to the ekklesia, the meeting of assembly of all citizens, and vote on proposals about governing the state. You could serve on the council, which was the body that prepared the business of the ekklesia, extremely important. You could serve as a magistrate. By the way, magistrates in ancient Athens were typically chosen by lot, by lottery, not by election, which is a characteristic of Athenian democracy in particular. And there were many other ways too, particularly the courts. The court system was something that was extremely important in confirming people power because bodies of 500 citizens could indeed bring magistrates before the court to account for what they had done during their time in office. So we have this idea of robust political participation that is deeply embedded, again, only for the adult male citizens. Now, finally comes my fourth point, the idea that you can live as you like in a democracy, and that that's a key aspect of liberty. You can set your own agenda, you can pursue your own interests. And of course, there were many thinkers in Greek political discourse who thought that that was terrible. Plato, for example, thought that that was terrible. For Plato, in the Republic, the democratic man was somebody who was totally chaotic, was pulled in all sorts of different directions, had no consistency. That was not a good ideal for Plato. But for somebody like Pericles in the funeral oration of Thucydides, this was part of the key of being an Athenian, that you could adapt. You were very varied in your achievements, in your interests. That diversity was something that was very much celebrated. So I want to talk a little bit about the ancient discourse of liberty, as we can see from these four aspects, and compare it to the modern discourse. Now, if you think back to my 4 points, the first two are essentially negative liberties. They are freedoms from enslavement, freedom from tyranny. So in the sense in which this is typically used by scholars such as Isaiah Berlin, these are negative freedoms, negative liberties. But the other two are very much positive liberties. These are freedoms to do something, the ability to participate in politics, the ability to pursue whatever projects you may wish. So this ancient Athenian discourse of liberty includes both the negative liberty and the positive liberty. Berlin thought that ancient liberty was almost exclusively positive, not negative. It's a richer picture when you look at it a little bit more closely. Secondly, if you think about political participation versus pursuing your own private agenda, there is at least potentially a conflict between those two things. Perhaps the demands of the state impose unreasonable constraints on you. Perhaps you don't want to participate as much as the Athenian democracy requires. So Modern thinkers, at least, it seems to me, tend to focus on this question of the extent to which the state constrains individual liberty. That seems to me the basis of the whole discussion that we have in someone like Mill, also Benjamin Constant, the famous theorist, and also, of course, Isaiah Berlin. This idea that we should be worried about the state imposing constraints upon individual liberty. Now, that's not really the way in which these ancient Athenians looked at that problem at all. For them, these two things were self-confirming, or at least mutually affirming. The liberty of the individual makes it possible to have a robust democracy in the city, and vice versa. Having citizens participate in democracy gives them the capabilities to achieve the aims that they wish to achieve. So what I'm suggesting is, if we take this positive vision of liberty that we can extract from the Greek tradition, and we look at the way in which political participation can work along with individual freedom and individual liberty, we get a different perspective than the typical modern discourse of liberty that talks about state constraining individual liberty. So I think that that's worth thinking about and reflecting on as we think about what we might do to actually enhance liberty today. And there are two things that I want to mention very briefly that we might take from the ancient Athenian democratic experience that could be, I think, potentially helpful. One of them is giving rewards for political participation. Giving rewards for voting, for example. Paying somebody to vote. I do not know of any country where people are actually paid to vote. I know of some countries where people are fined if they do not vote. But I find it rather remarkable that we tend not to think of actually paying people to do this. And the ancient Athenians were very well aware that if you wanted some farmer from Sunion to come to Athens to vote, you were going to have to compensate that person so that they could actually go. They wouldn't participate otherwise. So active compensation, active reward for participation in democratic politics is something that the Athenian example illustrates very powerfully. Of course, there's a negative side. You could imagine somebody who just likes going to the court all the time, like the characters in Aristophanes' Wasps and so forth. So there's, of course, a negative side to all of these things, but I'm trying to focus on the ideal because I think that it's something that's valuable to think about today. So one of them is this idea of rewarding participation rather than punishing non-participation, okay? And the second point that I want to suggest is the idea of accountability. Because from the very beginning of Athenian democracy, what is absolutely fundamental to the Athenian democracy is that magistrates, office holders, anyone that you wish, is accountable to the people. The word is hypelsinos. In Aeschylus's Persians, for example, Darius is said to be not accountable in that way because he's an autocrat. So the idea of autocratic rule being rule that is unaccountable and the consequent need for accountability for all executive decisions is, I think, a fundamental and important fact. And when I reflect on the debates that we have in the United States about executive privilege, the unitary executive, I'm always struck by this fact that to an ancient Athenian, the idea that somebody from the executive branch would not be accountable via some sort of robust way to the legislative branch, thereby to the people, to an ancient Athenian, that would be utterly, that would be autocracy, right, or tyranny. So I think that this is something that we have strayed away from, this powerful ancient idea. So in a nutshell, what I'm suggesting is if we look at ancient Greek democratic theorizing, democratic ideology, we can see this positive interaction between individual liberty and indeed the participation of citizens in the state. I think that the statement of Justice Brandeis that was included in the pamphlet for the conference actually puts it very well. The purpose of the state is to enable citizens to develop and exercise their capacities to be individuals successful in the ways that they wish. And I think that nicely encapsulates the essence of this line of democratic thinking that we can reconstruct from ancient Greece, despite its many opponents over the years. So I'll stop at that point, and thank you.
But just one question to clarify, that the Athenians believed in democracy, and yet only 10% of the population could sort of participate.
Well, it wasn't only 10% could participate, so it was, let's say, 1/6. So 50,000 out of 300,000, those were the adult male citizens. And in fact, not all of them would have participated in any meeting of the assembly. The assembly could only hold 5,000 or 6,000 people. So there was essentially a rotation of people who would come through there and participate.
And if I call this an oligarchy rather than a democracy, what do you say?
Well, it is not because there's no property qualification.
Okay.
So there is no qualification of wealth. That is the sort of defining line. And in principle, they could all participate, and they all participated in these other venues, such as the courts, the council, and so forth. So there were many other ways than the assembly.
Yeah. They had no super yachts like the real oligarchs.
That they did not, no.
Thank you very much.
Trireme.